I didn't really prepare something to describe what happens in Malaysia in terms of how Malaysia handles the pandemic. But for a fair share, perhaps I can tell a little bit of story. Well, Malaysia started to detect its first case of COVID-19. Sorry, first of all, before I move on, I should thank the organizer, of course, the Center for Bioethics and Medical Humanities in Gadjah Mada University for inviting me to this event. This event is very meaningful to me personally because I was there in Gadjah Mada as a student when the center was established. So this is very, very meaningful to me. Thank you very much for having me here. Now, for a fair share, perhaps I'd like to share a bit about what happens in Malaysia in terms of how it handles the pandemic. Malaysia detected its first case in 25 January 2019, and then there were not many cases at that time. We only see a few cases every day, and then we had about 11 days around February, mid to end of February, we saw 11 days without cases, without any cases at all, 11 days, you see. And then by end of February, then started when we had the public cluster enraging. We start seeing tripling of cases, tripling or even the case increased 6 times in just in span of 10 days. And then that forced the government to enforce restrictions, total restrictions, starting 18 March. And what we mean by total restrictions is really total restrictions. People cannot move out of the house beyond 10 kilometers. And then all activities, really no activities except for essential services. That happens until the first lifting of the restrictions. The first easing of the restrictions was done around early May. And then by 10 June, the government decided to move on to the so-called recovery movement control order or recovery phases. And now we are practically still in recovery phases. The last 2 weeks seen another spike in certain areas of Sabah and certain areas in the northern peninsula of Malaysia. But according to the government, that was relatively under control. Some point of view from the ethics, perhaps, if we can discuss what that is, that the government do have total and very much centralized kind of organization which handles the pandemic. So everything is really handled by the federal government. And then starting 1st August, face mask is compulsory. People can be fined up to 1,000 ringgit Malaysia, which equals to about 3.5 million rupiah for not wearing masks in public places. So that's very much enforced. Now that's some share about what happens in Malaysia. But what I'd like to discuss today is something not very much related to what happens in Malaysia in terms of how it handles the pandemic. I'd like to I'd like to comment and share some thoughts on what recently happens actually in Indonesia and perhaps also in other countries as well with regards to recruitment of military personnel for clinical trial. I'd like to see to pose questions whether we should see it as problems of autonomy or this should be seen as duty. So I'd like to approach this from an angle that may not have been approached very frequently. I'd like to ask people to have a look at what Dr. Kristen Grady. Dr. Kristen Grady is a prominent bioethicist from the US, and not many people might know that she's actually the wife of the esteemed Dr. Anthony Fauci. In this book, Principles of Practice of Clinical Research, Kristen mentioned this statement, which I like very much, that I always use every time I teach students about ethical problems in clinical trials. The primary ethical tension in clinical research is that a few individuals are asked to accept some burden or risks as research subjects to benefit others and society. You see, a sentence that I highlight in red and underline is very important. A few individuals are asked to accept some burden or risks as research subjects to benefit others in society. So in this regard, what we see here is participation to clinical trials is actually a form of sacrifice and altruism. Right? Altruism is an ethical doctrine that holds that individuals have moral obligation to help, serve, or benefit others, if necessary, at the sacrifice of self-interest. More precisely, an action is morally right if the consequences of that action are more favorable than unfavorable to everyone else except the agent. So I'd like to approach participation to clinical trials from this angle, right? So I'm not going to, of course, there is a component of the 4 pillars of bioethics in how we should approach participation in clinical trials. But I think this is the underlying idea of how people should actually consider participation in clinical trials: sacrifice and altruism. So now, in ICH GCP, which is an international standard for clinical research, mentioned in one of its principles here, that freely given informed consent should be obtained from every subject prior to clinical trial participation. So in this sense, we understand that special attention in terms of application of this principle should be put on vulnerable groups, especially when it comes to superior subordinate relationships, minors, mentally challenged participants, and so on and so forth. Superior subordinate relationship happens in every corner of life, including what happens in the military. This is when I come to my next slide here, that it happens that Indonesia did some clinical trials for combination of drugs, and there is a statement here from a member of parliament that the clinical trial was quickly completed because of collaboration with the army, taking advantage of the new COVID-19 cluster in one of its military training schools. So what I imagine what happened was that those military personnel which happened to get infected with COVID-19 at that time was recruited to participate in the clinical trial. And then at the same time, we also see some news from China, that China approves COVID-19 vaccine for its military, and skipping final phase of testing. What happens is that the vaccine have completed phase 1 and phase 2, and phase 2, and not yet in phase 3. And then it released and it approves. China's Central Military Commission approved the use of the vaccine by the military for a period of 1 year. Not sure if this is in the context of clinical trial, but clearly that what phase which is normally required for approval of widespread use of a drug or vaccine was not done. Right. Okay. And then there comes the question whether is altruism applicable here, right? Well, before I'm going here, I would not be very concerned about the well-being of the military personnel. Why? Because I think in every nation, all governments would want to protect its very own system that will provide defense to their country. So they would not go on with those kind of things unless they are certain that their well-being is protected. So, because if anything, they are the one who are going to defend the nation. So in this case, a question comes: is altruism applicable? And then is principle of autonomy in this case is actually practical with the military hierarchy? Well, you can imagine, we can give them informed consent sheet and ask them to read that, and then say that you are free to participate, and you are not, you are free not to participate. Well, that's like that's probably in military. I don't feel, I'm not sure if that really matters, that really is applicable. It's probably like pointing a gun to you and then say that you're free to choose. Well, everyone knows it's probably not something free to choose. But at the end of the day, the question is this one: is it morally actually acceptable? Right. Let's go through this. If we start from altruism as something that underline the basis for participation in clinical trial, as I mentioned earlier. So altruism may be expected from autonomous decision making. So that's why autonomy is needed. Beside all other use of autonomy in participation of clinical trials. When you are given autonomy to decide whether you want to participate or not, then out of all those motivations, altruism may prevail. So it may be expected when you are given autonomy to decide. But autonomy itself is not a prerequisite for altruism. Altruism, on the other hand, is not always an objective of autonomous decision making. So in this case, a person may act voluntarily or autonomously because of non-altruistic motives. Vice versa, altruism can still be achieved by other means than voluntary or autonomous process. Yeah. Then come the next questions: that is actually autonomy applicable in military system? As I have mentioned earlier, there is an inherent problem in how you can actually apply autonomy in military system. Yeah? Altruism itself is actually inherent in the existence of military of every nation to protect the nation, of course. You cannot become a military personnel unless you are altruistically motivated. You are ready and willing to sacrifice yourself. These are a special set of individuals, really. Altruism in military is free from autonomy. You cannot imagine individual autonomy being applied in military. That will be chaotic. Right? So in fact, actually, individual autonomy is not recognizable in military system. And no nation, you would imagine, would require their military personnel to sign informed consent for going to war, right? Now, in this case, if you go back to clinical trials, would risks of injury or death in clinical trials supersede risk of injury or death in the war? So, the argument is that actually, should we actually use principle of autonomy when we need to recruit participations of clinical trials from among military personnel? There is, of course, limitations to the moral, to this moral ground, will the drug or vaccine go commercial? Who will benefit? Who will profit? So in this case, will actually the people really benefited, and then, or is it giant pharmaceutical manufacturers who are going to benefit? Right. So as a summary, perhaps I can say first that altruism provides the basis of individual participation in clinical trials. Yeah? And altruism is not dependent upon autonomous decision making of participation. Yeah? Individual autonomy may be applicable in recruitment process of clinical trial in military. Individual autonomy may not be applicable in the recruitment process of clinical trial in military, because it's really not practical. It's really, I think it's impossible to apply that however way you want to do it. But in this case, you can approach it from altruism perspective. So altruism that is motivated, that is led by duty, where participations can be seen as more of a duty rather than an autonomous process. Okay, I think that's the end of my presentation today. Thank you very much.